All right, prepare yourselves, because tonight we're going to dive into a chapter of history that is often overlooked, often sanitized, and utterly brutal. It's a truth that casts a long, chilling shadow over our modern understanding of identity and freedom. We're going to confront the raw, unvarnished reality of what it meant to exist outside the rigidly defined norms of medieval society, specifically for those whose love and desire simply didn't fit. Tonight, we're asking the stark and heartbreaking question, why being gay in medieval times was a death sentence. This isn't just about legal statutes, it's about a complete worldview, a societal fabric woven with threads of religious dogma, fear, superstition, and a pervasive need for control over every aspect of human life. Your modern mind, accustomed to concepts of personal liberty, privacy, and the freedom to love whom you choose, would find this world not just challenging, but utterly terrifying. Before we descend into this often uncomfortable truth, take a moment to consider your own world. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you nestled in a cozy modern home with the freedom to be yourself or to explore your identity without fear of state-sanctioned violence? Drop a comment below and let me know your location and the time, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Your engagement truly helps us continue to unearth these often forgotten yet crucial stories. Now take a deep breath. Picture a world where the church was the undisputed authority, where every aspect of life, from birth to death, was governed by religious doctrine. A world where personal salvation was paramount, and deviation from prescribed norms could literally mean eternal damnation and very real temporal death. The unseen threat, the pervasive power of the church and the doctrine of sin. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church was not just a spiritual guide. It was a colossal political, social, economic, and legal institution, arguably the single most powerful and unifying force on the continent. Its doctrines permeated every single layer of society, from the highest king in his opulent castle to the humblest peasant in his mud and thatch hut, dictating not only what people believed, but how they lived, how they organized their societies, how they formed families, and even how they died and prepared for the afterlife. There was no meaningful separation of church and state. The two were intricately entwined, with ecclesiastical church law often influencing, and in many cases directly overriding secular temporal law. To defy the church was, in essence, to defy God himself. And the consequences for such defiance were dire beyond modern comprehension, affecting both one's earthly existence and their eternal soul. Central to the church's teachings, and absolutely fundamental to medieval morality, was an extremely strict and narrow understanding of human sexuality. Any sexual act, not solely for the purpose of procreation within the confines of a sanctioned heterosexual marriage, was deemed not just sinful but profoundly so. This vast and unforgiving umbrella of forbidden acts included fornication, sex outside marriage, adultery, sex with someone else's spouse, masturbation, bestiality, and crucially any and all forms of same-sex sexual activity. Sodomy as the ultimate transgression against nature and God. The term sodomy became the prevalent and terrifying catch-all for any sexual acts considered unnatural or non-procreative. But it was predominantly and increasingly from the 12th century onwards associated with male same-sex relations. This was not simply a minor transgression, like a small lie or a petty theft. It was considered a particularly heinous sin, meticulously categorized as contra naturam, against nature. Theologians, canon lawyers, and moralists elevated it far beyond other sins, often equating it with blasphemy, heresy, direct defiance of church doctrine, and sometimes even patricide, because it was perceived as a direct challenge to God's created order and his divine plan for humanity. The infamous biblical narrative from the book of Genesis, detailing the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19, was not merely a story, but a core theological justification and a constant terrifying divine warning. It was invoked incessantly in sermons, theological treatises, legal commentaries, and public condemnations, leaving no doubt that fire and brimstone awaited those who engaged in such acts. This pervasive interpretation imbued sodomy with a cosmic significance. It was seen as an act that could bring down God's wrath, not just on individuals, but on entire communities and kingdoms. profound theological and scholastic condemnation. The intellectual powerhouses of the medieval church, revered figures whose writings shaped the very thought process of the age, wrote extensively and vehemently against sodomy. Peter Damian, an influential 11th century cardinal, famously penned Liber Gomorrhianus, the Book of Gomorrah, a treatise that lambasted same-sex acts as a monstrous vice. He argued that it corrupted the soul, defiled the body, invited divine wrath, and threatened the spiritual and physical well-being of the entire Christian populace, leading to pestilence, famine, and military defeat. Centuries later, Thomas Aquinas, the most influential scholastic philosopher and theologian of the 13th century, further solidified this condemnation in his monumental Summa Theologica. Aquinas meticulously categorized sexual sins, and while he considered rape and incest grave, he placed sodomy in a uniquely abominable category as a sin against nature because it violated the natural purpose of sex, procreation. This philosophical and theological framework, taught in every university and monastery, permeated the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy, fueling public fear, prejudice, and an unwavering desire for purging what was seen as a profound defilement and a direct insult to God. The very intellectual scaffolding of the age classified such desires as inherently disordered, monstrous, and mortally dangerous. The crushing weight of confession and penance. For the individual medieval person, daily life was a constant exercise in navigating the omnipresent threat of sin and the arduous path to salvation. The sacrament of confession was absolutely central to this journey, mandatory at least once a year, often more frequently for devout individuals. Priests were rigorously trained, often with detailed confessors' manuals, to inquire about all forms of sexual transgression, leaving no stone unturned in the penitent's conscience. If you harbored same-sex desires or, God forbid, acted upon them, you were living in a constant, agonizing state of mortal sin, a spiritual sickness so severe that it would condemn your immortal soul to eternal damnation in the fiery pits of hell if you died without absolution. This created an immense, paralyzing internal psychological pressure, guilt, and existential terror. The penances assigned for such grave sins were often exceptionally severe, far beyond mere prayers. They could range from extended fasts, sometimes for years, arduous pilgrimages to distant holy sites, public humiliation, such as wearing a specific penitential garment, severe forms of self-flagellation, forced periods of celibacy and monastic contemplation. All these measures were meticulously designed not only to purify the individual's soul, but also to deter any repetition of the monstrous vice. This constant threat of eternal fire, vividly depicted in church frescoes and sermons, was an incredibly powerful motivator for outward conformity, regardless of one's inner inclinations or true desires. Spiritual cleansing, social control, and communal fear. The prevailing societal belief was that the community as a whole, not just the individual sinner, would suffer if such unnatural sins were tolerated within its midst. A town or kingdom that allowed sodomy to fester was believed to be inviting devastating divine punishment, such as devastating famine, widespread plague, military defeat by enemies, or natural disasters. This pervasive collective fear of divine wrath fueled a communal need to identify, denounce, and rigorously purge anyone perceived to be committing unnatural acts. This led to a pervasive climate of suspicion, denunciation, and often brutal internal policing within villages and bustling towns. Neighbors watched neighbors, family members observed each other, and the spiritual sanctity and very survival of the entire community were perceived to be at stake. This was not merely about individual morality. It was about the communal well-being and the continued favor of God over the entire Christian world. The pressure to conform, to appear outwardly pious and heteronormative, was not just about personal survival, but about the collective safety. Your modern understanding of sexuality as a spectrum or as a private matter of personal identity to be explored and embraced would be completely alien, indeed dangerously incomprehensible, in medieval Europe. In those times, your desires were emphatically not your own. They were subject to divine law, meticulously interpreted and mercilessly enforced by a powerful institution that demanded absolute, unquestioning conformity. The very thought of same-sex attraction, even if unacted upon, was a seed of damnation, a profound stain on your immortal soul, and a terrifying threat to your community's salvation. The legal system. Secular law enforces ecclesiastical decree with brutal precision. It wasn't just the church's spiritual condemnation that threatened individuals. Secular law across medieval Europe increasingly adopted and enforced the church's severe views on sodomy, effectively turning a theological sin into a capital crime that was executed with chilling and often gruesome efficiency. This represents a critical point where religious dogma transformed into state-sanctioned violence. From penitence to punishment and public execution, while early medieval laws influenced by evolving Roman and Germanic tribal traditions might have focused primarily on ecclesiastical penance, fines, or banishment for various forms of sexual misconduct, a profound and brutal shift occurred by the High and especially the late Middle Ages, roughly from the 12th century onwards, peaking in the 14th and 15th centuries. Secular authorities, kings, dukes, counts, and city councils across major kingdoms and regions like France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, encompassing much of modern Germany, Austria and Central Europe, various Italian city-states, the Iberian Peninsula, and even parts of Scandinavia began to explicitly criminalize same-sex sexual acts with escalating and extreme severity. This grim evolution directly reflected the Church's growing political and moral influence. The rise of more centralized, powerful states seeking to enforce moral order through civil means and a pervasive societal fear of divine retribution. Laws were meticulously codified that made sodomy a felony punishable by death, transforming a spiritual transgression into a temporal, state-sanctioned execution that left no room for mercy. Capital offense and gruesome, symbolic methods. Sodomy became a universally recognized capital offense across much of Western Europe, meaning the predetermined punishment upon conviction was death. But it wasn't just any death. The methods of execution were often particularly brutal, symbolic, and designed to inflict maximum suffering, public humiliation, and to physically cleanse the land of the perceived taint. Burning at the stake. This was arguably the most common and terrifying punishment for sodomy, notably because it was a method primarily reserved for heresy, a defiance of God's word and church authority. By applying it to those accused of sodomy, the secular authorities deliberately underscored the idea that same-sex acts were not merely sexual offenses, but a profound form of spiritual rebellion, a direct desecration of the natural and divine order established by God. Burning was believed to purify the body and soul through fire, mirroring the eternal flames of hell and leaving no physical trace. A complete consumption of the body, symbolizing utter annihilation and the obliteration of the sinner from both earthly and divine memory. The agonizing pain and slow death were part of the intended message. Castration followed by burning or hanging. In some specific regions or under particular legal codes, the punishment could involve emasculation or mutilation, specifically targeting the male body as the perceived instrument of the sin before the ultimate execution. This added another chilling layer of dehumanization, public degradation, and symbolic destruction of the perceived source of the unnatural desire. It was meant to permanently mark the condemned public display and terrifying deterrence. These executions were almost universally public spectacles, conducted in prominent town squares, marketplaces, or outside city walls. They were meticulously designed to act as terrifying deterrents, grim morality plays intended to instill profound fear, enforce absolute conformity, and showcase the unwavering power of both spiritual and temporal authorities. The agonizing suffering and public degradation of the condemned served as a vivid, visceral warning to anyone in the gathered crowd harboring similar unnatural desires or even considering deviation from the strict norms. The message was clear. This could be you. Lack of due process and vague accusations. While medieval legal systems did exist and evolved over time, they were notoriously far from modern standards of justice, particularly when dealing with charges imbued with such religious and moral horror. Accusations could be easily made, often based on rumor, personal vendettas, anonymous denunciations, which were shockingly common, especially during inquisitions, or even the suspicions of a disgruntled neighbor or servant. A single witness, often without corroboration or even a confession obtained under severe torture, which, chillingly, was a legally permissible and frequently used tool for interrogation in many jurisdictions, could be sufficient for a conviction. You would have virtually no right to legal counsel, no meaningful presumption of innocence. In fact, the accusation itself often implied a heavy burden of presumed guilt and little to no chance to appeal a verdict handed down by a local lord's court or an ecclesiastical tribunal. Your fate would often be sealed by the accusation itself, particularly if you were an outsider, lacked powerful social connections, or were already viewed with suspicion. The very vagueness and broadness of the term sodomy meant that it could be applied to almost any non-procreative sexual act, making a vast array of behaviors, even those not explicitly same-sex, a potential death sentence. Pervasive, intolerance, minimal escape routes, while specific laws, their precise wording, and their enforcement might vary slightly from one kingdom, duchy, or independent city-state to another. For example, some Italian city-states might have shifted punishments between severe fines, banishment, or death over different periods depending on political and religious climates. The fundamental principle of extreme condemnation and brutal punishment for sodomy remained tragically consistent and deeply pervasive across virtually all of Christianized Western Europe. You couldn't simply move to a more tolerant region as you might cross a modern border. The intolerance was deeply embedded in the legal, social, and spiritual fabric of the entire continent. Even if a specific locality had very brief periods of slightly less severe enforcement, the Church's unwavering doctrine remained. A constant lurking threat of spiritual condemnation and inevitable social ostracism. There was no true safe haven for those whose desires were deemed anathema. Royal and imperial decrees reinforced Church doctrine. Powerful secular rulers, far from resisting the Church's stance, actively echoed and reinforced its condemnations in their own legal codes, demonstrating the profound symbiosis between spiritual and temporal power. For instance, the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina 1532, a meticulously detailed and widely applied criminal legal code for the vast and influential Holy Roman Empire, which stretched across much of modern Germany, Austria, and parts of France and Italy, explicitly stated that men who engage in lewdness with other men, their legal term for sodomy, should be condemned to death by burning alive. This was not some obscure local bylaw. It was a foundational, imperial legal text influencing justice across a huge swath of Europe. Similarly, major legal compilations like the Saxonspiegel, a foundational German legal code, French royal ordinances, and English common law, which defined boogery as a capital felony, all contained similar severe prohibitions and punishments. These consistent laws across diverse regions illustrate a powerful, unified, and terrifying front between secular power and ecclesiastical authority against same-sex relations, leaving no doubt about the state's intent to brutally eradicate such perceived deviance. Your modern expectation of legal protection, your right to privacy, or even just the absence of state-sanctioned violence for your identity, would be a fatal delusion, a dangerous fantasy in medieval times. In that era, the law was not a shield for individual rights. It was a sword, wielded by both church and state, poised to strike down with agonizing cruelty anyone who dared to live or even exist in secret outside their narrow, rigid definition of acceptable sexuality. The constant chilling threat of torture, public humiliation, and an agonizing death was a tangible, omnipresent reality, specifically designed to eradicate not just the act, but the very possibility of non-conforming desire from the face of the earth. Think about the sheer terror of facing a legal system where your private desires could lead to public execution with no meaningful defense or appeal. What do you think would be the most horrifying aspect of the legal consequences for being gay in medieval Europe? Is it the public shame and dehumanization, the agonizing method of execution, or the sheer injustice of the legal system itself that allowed such accusations to lead to swift, brutal death? Share your chilling thoughts below. The social fabric, vigilance, suspicion, and the absence of privacy beyond the formal pronouncements of church and state, the very structure and daily rhythms of medieval society itself served as an omnipresent and inescapable force of control, leaving virtually no room for deviation from the meticulously defined sexual and social norms. This was a world utterly, fundamentally devoid of the modern concept of privacy, where every action, every interaction, and every seemingly private moment was potentially observed, judged, and scrutinized by 1,000 watchful eyes. The unblinking eye of the community. For the vast majority of medieval people, life was profoundly communal and deeply interconnected, especially in the small villages, hamlets, and even the burgeoning towns. Homes were often small, with multiple generations living in incredibly close quarters, sharing limited space. Forget private bedrooms in the modern sense. Even within more affluent noble or merchant households, Sleeping arrangements were often communal, with many individuals, including servants and retainers, sharing large halls or chambers, sometimes partitioned only by curtains or rudimentary screens. This pervasive lack of physical privacy meant that any deviation from expected behavior, any intimate gesture, or even a subtle glance that lingered too long, was immediately noticeable. Your neighbors, your extended family, your landlord, your guildmates, and critically, your local priest would all be intimately aware of your daily comings and goings, your friendships, your habits, and any unusual patterns in your behavior. A private conversation, a clandestine meeting, or a moment of affectionate vulnerability could be observed, misinterpreted through a lens of suspicion, and quickly lead to damning rumors or outright accusations. There was no urban anonymity to hide within. Everyone had a recognized place, a family, a trade, and a meticulously tracked reputation within their localized world. The family as the inflexible unit of control. In medieval society, the family was not merely a collection of individuals. It was the fundamental, indispensable unit of social, economic, and spiritual organization. Your identity, your purpose, and your future were primarily defined by your role within this lineage, not by individual aspiration. Marriages were almost universally strategic alliances, meticulously negotiated by parents, guardians, or powerful patrons, often when the prospective spouses were still children or young adolescents. Factors such as dowries, land tenure, social standing, political influence, and dynastic aspirations far outweighed any notion of personal affection or compatibility. The proper continuation of the family line through legitimate, meaning heterosexual, procreative heirs was paramount, a sacred duty. If you were a man, your absolute primary responsibility was to marry and produce legitimate children to carry on the family name, inherit property, and ensure its future prosperity. If you were a woman, your value was almost entirely tied to your fertility, your ability to manage a household, and your capacity to bear healthy children. To be gay meant by its very nature to defy this fundamental, inescapable societal expectation of procreation within a heterosexual marriage. Your desires were deemed sterile, pointless in the eyes of God, society, and your lineage, a betrayal of your family's very survival and legacy. The fear of bringing indelible shame upon your family, potentially jeopardizing the marriage prospects of your siblings, or even leading to the forfeiture of inheritance or titles, was an overwhelmingly powerful deterrent. Family members, desperate to protect their collective standing, might even be incentivized to report or control deviant behavior within their own ranks. Community as the ultimate moral guardian. Beyond the immediate family, the entire local community saw itself as a collective moral guardian, responsible for the spiritual and social rectitude of its members. Village elders, influential figures, guild masters in towns, and local noblemen or their representatives all played active roles in enforcing societal norms. Public shaming rituals such as the infamous chivalry, a noisy, humiliating procession involving pots, pans, and jeers, often targeting those who defied marital or sexual norms, were frequently used to punish those who violated social expectations, including sexual ones. Imagine being subjected to such public ridicule, having your perceived vices or unnaturalness shouted aloud for all to hear, your reputation utterly destroyed, leaving you a pariah. The psychological toll of living under such intense, constant communal surveillance and judgment, knowing that ostracism could mean not just social exclusion, but literal starvation or a desperate, dangerous migration, would be immense. There was no escaping the ever-present, judging eyes of your community. These were the very people you lived, worked, worshipped, and shared your life with every single day. The pervasive power of gossip and rumor. In a society with limited formal communication, no mass media, and few reliable sources of information beyond word of mouth, gossip and rumor were incredibly potent, often destructive forces. A whispered accusation, a suspicious glance misinterpreted, a casual interaction observed out of context, or a misunderstanding could quickly spiral into a widespread, damning belief. Without any means to publicly refute such rumors, to clear your name in a public forum, your good name could be irreparably damaged, leading to social isolation, economic ruin, and ultimately setting the stage for formal accusation and brutal punishment. The constant, gnawing anxiety of being gossiped about, of being subtly marked as different, unclean, or sinful would be a profound psychological burden, making every social interaction a potential minefield. Informers, denunciations, and the fragility of trust. The prevailing climate of intense religious fervor, coupled with the profound fear of damnation, often actively encouraged people to inform on others, whether out of genuine, fervent piety, personal animosity, a desire for social credit with local authorities, or even under duress. Individuals might report perceived sins to local priests, manorial lords, or secular authorities. This created an insidious environment where trust was incredibly fragile, where even close friendships or familial bonds could be betrayed. For an individual harboring same-sex desires, every interaction, every shared secret, every nascent friendship carried an inherent, terrifying risk of denunciation and brutal reprisal. This atmosphere of potential betrayal would breed deep paranoia, forcing an individual further into psychological isolation. Your modern world offers you the relative anonymity of large cities, the enshrined privacy of your own home, and a general societal expectation that your personal life, so long as it causes no harm, is your own business. In medieval times, your personal life was the community's business, constantly subject to intense surveillance, relentless judgment, and the terrifying possibility of denunciation. The sheer weight of this collective scrutiny would be suffocating, forcing any non-conforming desires deep underground, if they could even survive the initial, internalized self-censorship and profound guilt. The psychological torment, internalized guilt, isolation, and existential dread beyond the relentless external threats of the church, law, and society. The internal landscape for an individual grappling with same-sex desires in medieval Europe would be a relentless, agonizing battlefield of guilt, profound fear, and overwhelming existential dread. This was a torment far more insidious than physical pain, eroding the very core of one's being, the unbearable burden of mortal sin. From the earliest moments of childhood, you would be ceaselessly indoctrinated into a worldview where sodomy was categorized as one of the gravest, most abominable sins, guaranteeing a horrifying descent into the eternal damnation of hellfire. Every powerful sermon delivered from the pulpit, every vivid religious painting adorning church walls depicting the horrific torments of the damned, every mandatory confession you attended, every ritual you participated in would tirelessly reinforce this terrifying, inescapable truth. If you felt an undeniable attraction to someone of the same sex, or worse, if you ever acted upon those desires, you would instantly carry an unbearable, crushing burden of mortal sin. You would genuinely believe your immortal soul was irrevocably tainted, destined for an endless, unimaginable suffering in the afterlife, if you died without immediate and genuine absolution. This was not just an abstract theological concept. It was the ultimate, inescapable, all-consuming terror that permeated every waking moment of your existence. Profound self-loathing and extreme repression. The constant pervasive messaging that your intrinsic desires were unnatural, vile, disordered, demonic, and a direct insult to God would inevitably lead to profound self-loathing and extreme, often violent self-repression. You would be relentlessly taught to hate a fundamental, innate part of yourself, to fight against instincts and attractions that you simply couldn't control. This agonizing internal conflict, the ceaseless battle against your own very nature, would be a source of immense, chronic psychological pain, a relentless struggle for any semblance of inner peace or self-acceptance. You would be your own tormentor, constantly battling a demon within. Absolute isolation and utter secrecy. The sheer, overwhelming danger of discovery meant you would live in profound, agonizing secrecy. There would be no understanding support networks, no sympathetic peers, no safe spaces, no trusted confidants with whom to express your true feelings, anxieties, or joys. Any nascent relationships you might dare to attempt would be deeply clandestine, fraught with constant paranoia, and conducted under the crushing, omnipresent shadow of exposure and brutal punishment. This enforced isolation, this inability to ever truly be vulnerable or authentic with another soul, would lead to intense, debilitating loneliness, compounding the already overwhelming internalized guilt and existential dread. Imagine never being able to genuinely be yourself, never being able to share your deepest affections, always forced to wear a mask, constantly living a lie. the relentless fear of exposure. Every unexpected knock at the door, every suspicious glance from a neighbor, every whispered conversation heard just out of earshot could trigger a debilitating wave of pure panic. The chilling fear of being found out, of having your most terrifying secret brutally torn open and exposed to public humiliation, agonizing torture, and a horrifying public death would be a constant, debilitating anxiety. You would likely develop hypervigilance, constantly scanning your environment for threats, unable to truly relax or feel genuinely safe anywhere, even within your own supposed home. This chronic, unrelenting stress would quickly erode both your mental and physical health, leading to perpetual exhaustion and a profound sense of despair. No hope for a normal or fulfilling life. The rigid medieval societal structure offered no legitimate path to a fulfilling or accepted life for someone openly gay. Openly gay, marriage heterosexual, explicitly procreative, was the only sanctioned form of partnership, the only way to establish a legitimate family, gain social standing, achieve economic security, and ensure support in old age. If you could not or would not participate in this prescribed norm, your future was bleak and terrifying. Perpetual social ostracism, a lifetime of agonizing secrecy, or the desperate, often coerced choice of a religious life, which also required vows of strict celibacy. The complete absence of any positive future vision for your authentic identity would be utterly soul-crushing, leading to deep depression and a profound sense of hopelessness. The absence of language and community, you wouldn't even have the words, concepts, or social frameworks of gay, lesbian, bisexual, or LGBTQ+ identity as they exist today. You would be utterly isolated in your experience, without any shared language or cultural framework to understand your feelings as anything other than a monstrous aberration or a demonic temptation. There was no community for support, no shared sense of identity or struggle. Rather, the very community you were part of was the primary source of the threat and condemnation. This intellectual and social void would intensify your internal suffering, making you feel truly unique in your sin, with no one to turn to. Your modern world, despite its imperfections, allows for self-acceptance, a pursuit of individual happiness, and the comfort of community for LGBTQ+ individuals. In medieval times, your very existence, if it deviated from the brutal norm, would be a source of unending existential dread, a private hell of internalized guilt and self-loathing, and a constant terrifying dance with the specter of public condemnation and violent death. The psychological toll alone would be enough to utterly break the modern mind, far before the physical threats could even materialize. Consider the immense psychological burden of living with such a profound, dangerous secret under constant threat of eternal damnation and earthly execution. What do you think would be the single most difficult psychological aspect to endure for someone gay in medieval times? Is it the crushing isolation, the internalized self-loathing, or the relentless, pervasive fear of exposure that could lead to an agonizing death? Share your empathetic thoughts below. Medical and scientific ignorance. A world without understanding. In medieval times, the profound lack of scientific understanding, particularly in medicine, biology, and psychology, played an absolutely crucial and devastating role in perpetuating and intensifying the condemnation of same-sex relations. Without any comprehension of genetics, hormones, neurobiology, or the complex nuances of human psychology, any deviation from what was perceived as natural heterosexual behavior was invariably attributed to a grave moral failing, a malignant demonic influence, or a direct divine punishment, and never, ever to a biological or innate predisposition. This fundamental absence of scientific insight was a foundational pillar of the era's pervasive intolerance. The absolute absence of the concept of innate sexuality. The very idea that someone could be born with a specific sexual orientation, that it could be an inherent and unchangeable part of their identity, was utterly absent from medieval thought. Sexuality was understood almost exclusively as an act, a conscious choice of behavior that could either be righteous and in accordance with divine will, i.e. procreative within the confines of marriage, or profoundly sinful and contra naturam, i.e. anything else. Therefore, if you felt an attraction towards someone of the same sex, it was not perceived as a natural inclination or an intrinsic trait of your personality. Instead, it was rigorously interpreted as a deliberate yielding to temptation, a profound weakness of character, a moral perversion, or, most terrifyingly, a direct demonic suggestion. This fundamental misunderstanding meant there was absolutely no possibility of empathy, acceptance, or understanding rooted in a biological or psychological reality. Your deepest feelings would be rigorously labeled as a divine test of your faith or a malevolent whisper from the devil, never as a natural, valid variation of human experience. You would have been exhorted to pray the gay away, quite literally, believing that you could and must completely suppress this intrinsic part of your being through sheer willpower and divine intervention. Humoral theory and its misinterpretations. Medieval medicine was largely predicated on the ancient Greek humoral theory, which posited that the human body was composed of 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was believed to depend on the perfect balance of these humors, and illness was considered a direct result of an imbalance. While this theory was predominantly applied to physical ailments, it occasionally intersected with discussions of temperament and personality, and even moral disposition. Some scholastic thinkers might have theoretically attributed unnatural sexual desires to an imbalance of humors. But this would still have been viewed as a correctable state, a deviation from the healthy, divinely ordained norm, requiring rigorous purging or balancing, rather than something inherent and unchangeable to an individual. It served not as an excuse for behavior deemed sinful, but rather as another lens through which deviance was understood as a form of sickness that needed to be cured, not accepted. Any cure would, of course, align with prevailing religious dogma, leading to harsh treatments meant to correct the moral and physical imbalance. Demonic possession and the terrors of exorcism. For many unexplained behaviors, particularly those that defied understanding or persisted despite moral condemnation, the most common and terrifying explanation was outright demonic possession or influence. If you found yourself unable to suppress your same-sex desires, or if you continued to act on them, even in secret, you might genuinely come to believe you were afflicted by a malevolent demon. Or, more commonly, others would suspect this widespread belief would lead to terrifying cures like exorcisms, often performed by priests or specialized exorcists, involving fervent prayers, prolonged fasting, physical restraint, and sometimes even severe abuse, all aimed at expelling the supposed evil spirit that was compelling you to sin. These attempts at treatment would be harrowing, traumatic, and utterly ineffective, only serving to deepen your self-loathing, intensify your fear of eternal damnation, and offer no genuine relief or understanding for your true feelings. Instead, they would reinforce the idea that your very nature was demonic. The complete absence of psychology and therapeutic support. There was absolutely no concept of mental health as we understand it today, nor any form of psychological or psychiatric therapy. The profound struggles you faced, the crushing internalized homophobia, the agonizing loneliness, the crippling anxiety, the severe depression stemming from living a perpetual lie, would be entirely unaddressed and misunderstood. There were no therapists, no support groups, no understanding ears, no compassionate frameworks for self-acceptance. Your internal torment would be an utterly solitary battle, often interpreted by yourself and others as further irrefutable evidence of your deep-seated sinfulness or spiritual weakness, trapping you in an agonizing, inescapable cycle of despair. You would simply be expected to conquer your desires through sheer, brutal force of will, relentless prayer and harsh penance, with absolutely no scientific or compassionate framework to explain why this was an impossible, torturous demand. Your mental suffering would be invisible and unacknowledged, deepening your isolation. Superstition and folk beliefs reinforced the fear of the unnatural. Alongside formal church doctrine and nascent medical theories, a rich and pervasive tapestry of local superstitions, folk beliefs, and magical thinking influenced every aspect of medieval daily life. While not always explicitly about sexuality, these beliefs often reinforced a deep-seated fear and suspicion of anything unnatural, anomalous, or outside the accepted order. Anyone perceived as different, strange, or exhibiting behaviors that defied conventional explanation could easily be viewed with intense suspicion, potentially associated with witchcraft, sorcery, or malevolent supernatural forces. While rarely explicitly linked solely to homosexuality and formal accusations, this general climate of fear and suspicion towards the other, towards any perceived deviation from the norm, would add yet another insidious layer of danger and social precariousness for anyone whose true identity or desires placed them outside the rigid societal mold, making life even more precarious and profoundly isolating. Your modern world, despite its challenges, allows for rigorous scientific inquiry into human behavior, offers diverse mental health support, and understands that sexuality is a complex, varied, and often innate aspect of human experience. In medieval times, science provided no such comfort or explanation. Instead, ignorance fueled relentless condemnation, trapping individuals in a terrifying cycle of blame, futile cure attempts, and agonizing despair, all based on a complete and devastating misunderstanding of their inherent nature. The hypocrisy and hidden lives, noblemen, clergy, and the secret world. While the official condemnations from the church and the legal system were absolute, uncompromising, and brutally enforced, historical records, confessional manuals, and even literary sources subtly suggest that same-sex relations, though incredibly risky and utterly hidden, did indeed occur. This reveals a chilling and pervasive hypocrisy within a society that so vehemently condemned what it also perhaps secretly practiced or quietly vehemently condemned, what it also perhaps secretly practiced or quietly tolerated among its most powerful echelons. Carry a secret lives of the elite. For powerful noblemen, wealthy merchants, and even kings, the consequences of accusations of sodomy could be devastating, potentially leading to social ruin, political overthrow, or even death. However, their immense power, vast wealth, and extensive networks of influence often afforded them a significant degree of protection, discretion, and deniability that was utterly unavailable to commoners. Historical figures like King Edward II of England are perhaps the most famous example, widely associated with accusations of sodomy and intensely close, possibly sexual, relationships with male favorites such as Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser the Younger. While Edward II's ultimate fate was grim, he was deposed and almost certainly murdered in a gruesome manner. His downfall was as much, if not more, driven by complex political rivalries, baronial discontent, and military failures as by genuine moral outrage over his personal life. Other monarchs, powerful lords, or influential cardinals might have maintained incredibly discreet same-sex relationships, their elevated status providing a crucial shield that common individuals could only dream of. Their sins might be carefully overlooked by those dependent on them, explained away by convenient fictions, or simply remain a whispered secret confined to the highest, most privileged circles, while a peasant engaging in precisely the same behavior faced immediate, agonizing death and public ignominy. Homosocial environments and unspoken bonds. Medieval society, particularly for men, was often organized around intensely homosocial environments. Monasteries, cathedral chapters, knightly orders, burgeoning universities, and royal or noble courts were overwhelmingly male-dominated spaces where men lived, worked, studied, worshipped, and fought in incredibly close proximity, sometimes for their entire lives. While these environments were generally predicated on vows of celibacy for clergy or official heterosexual norms, the sheer intensity of male bonding, camaraderie, shared intellectual pursuits, and constant shared living conditions could, for some, have naturally fostered deeper, more profound, and perhaps romantic or even sexual attachments. Records, often in the form of disciplinary actions or accusations, occasionally hint at scandals within monastic communities or at court, suggesting that despite the rigid vows, strict rules, and brutal laws, human nature, with its inherent needs for intimacy and connection, found ways to express itself, albeit always in profound, terrifying secrecy. These tightly insular environments, while certainly not openly accepting, might paradoxically have provided a unique, though still inherently dangerous, space for such connections to form, precisely because they were so closed off from broader societal scrutiny in some respects. The clergy and their conflicted vows. The celibate clergy, particularly monks, friars, and secular priests, found themselves in a unique and often deeply conflicted position. Sworn to vows of chastity and celibacy, many struggled immensely with all forms of sexual desire, including same-sex attraction, the very human urges they were mandated to suppress. While official condemnation was arguably strongest for those who were supposed to embody the highest moral and spiritual standards, historical records, such as those from episcopal visitations or monastic chronicles, contained documented instances of accusations, trials, and severe punishments within the church itself for sodomy among the clergy. This painful reality highlights the inherent, almost impossible difficulty of enforcing such rigidly unnatural sexual norms in exclusively male environments. These instances, when they came to light, were devastating scandals for the church, but they unequivocally confirmed that same-sex acts did occur, even among those most strictly sworn to God and the eradication of such sin. The pervasive double life. For those individuals who engaged in same-sex relations or even harbored same-sex desires, it almost universally meant living a constant, agonizing double life. Publicly, they would meticulously conform to all societal expectations, perhaps even entering into heterosexual marriages to produce heirs, secure property, and maintain appearances and social standing. Privately, and always under the crushing weight of fear, guilt, and pervasive secrecy, they would seek out clandestine encounters, fleeting moments of connection, or forbidden intimacy. This profound dichotomy, the constant, exhausting performance of a heterosexual identity, while simultaneously harboring and sometimes acting upon secret, condemned desires, would be an immense and relentless psychological burden. It speaks volumes about the incredible human capacity for resilience, adaptation, and the desperate yearning for connection, even in the face of overwhelming societal repression. However, it also highlights the horrific, omnipresent risks involved, making every intimate moment a terrifying dance with exposure and potential death. Literary hints and subtext. While explicit depictions of same-sex relationships were exceedingly rare and extremely dangerous in medieval literature due to censorship and fear of reprisal, some scholarly interpretations of medieval poetry, courtly romances, and even theological texts contain subtle hints, coded allusions, or even thinly veiled celebrations of same-sex affection. These elements are often disguised through metaphor, allegory, or ambiguity to avoid direct censorship or accusations. While open to academic debate, these veiled references suggest that same-sex love, even if vehemently condemned and suppressed, was not entirely absent from the medieval consciousness or imagination. These poignant, hidden literary glimpses offer a rare, bittersweet window into a world where true feelings had to hide behind layers of metaphor, symbolism, and deliberate ambiguity, a testament to the power of human emotion to find expression even in the darkest of times. The undeniable existence of these hidden lives, and the occasional, often brutally punished instances of same-sex relations across all social strata, profoundly reveals the inherent human need for connection, intimacy, and authentic self-expression, even in the face of overwhelming societal, religious, and legal repression. But more importantly, it terrifyingly underscores the horrific, constant risks involved, highlighting the omnipresent, lurking danger for anyone whose true desires were deemed anathema and who dared to seek solace or connection outside the rigid, unforgiving norms. The very act of living with such a profound, dangerous secret was itself a form of psychological torture, an ongoing death sentence for any hope of authenticity or peace. Considering the immense societal pressure and the brutal legal consequences, what do you think was the most compelling and terrifying reason for individuals in medieval times to enter into heterosexual marriages, even if they harbored same-sex desires? Was it simply a matter of basic survival, absolute social acceptance, or something deeper like the desperate hope for a semblance of a normal life? Share your chilling insights below. The invisible women, condemnation, erasure, and a different kind of danger. While the word sodomy and the most explicit death sentences were predominantly aimed at men, medieval society was no haven for women who harbored same-sex desires. Their struggles were often more insidious, marked by erasure, medical ignorance, and a different yet equally devastating set of social and religious condemnations that rendered their lives just as precarious, if not more so than their male counterparts. Legal silence, social condemnation, legal codes across medieval Europe, when they explicitly mentioned same-sex acts, focused almost exclusively on male sodomy. This silence, however, did not imply tolerance for female same-sex relations. Instead, it often meant that these acts were either conceptually ignored, as medieval legal and theological minds often struggled to conceive of female sexual agency outside of male penetration, or they were subsumed under broader categories of unchastity, lust, sin against nature, or even heresy, depending on the context and the accusers. While women were rarely burned at the stake specifically for sodomy, as men were, they could face other severe punishments, public shaming, forced penance, imprisonment in convents, forced marriage, or even accusations of witchcraft, particularly if their nonconformity was seen as part of a larger pattern of defiance against patriarchal norms. The lack of explicit legal definition could sometimes be a dubious protection, but it often just meant their existence was denied, and their desires were unimaginable, leaving them without any recognized legal framework, even a negative one. The obsession with virginity and procreation. For women, societal value was almost entirely tied to their virginity before marriage, their chastity within it, and their capacity for procreation. A woman who expressed no interest in men, who resisted marriage, or who failed to produce children, would be viewed with deep suspicion. Her desires, if perceived as non-procreative, would be seen as a direct affront to her primary social function. This could lead to intense family pressure, forced marriages, often to much older or undesirable men, or forced entry into convents. The convent, while offering a form of escape from marriage, also demanded strict celibacy and communal living, offering little true privacy for genuine same-sex relationships, and carrying its own risks of internal scrutiny and accusations of unnatural affections among nuns. Tribadism and medical misconception. While not as widely codified as male sodomy, some later medieval and early modern medical and legal texts did acknowledge, albeit vaguely and with disgust, what they termed tribadism, sexual activity between women, often with the misconception that one woman must assume a male role using artificial means. These references, though rarer, still condemned such acts as unnatural and perverse. The very medical and biological understanding of the time struggled to conceive of female sexual pleasure or agency outside of male penetration, further marginalizing and demonizing any non-conforming female sexuality. Double burden of gender and sexuality. For women, living with same-sex desires meant a double burden. Not only were they defying rigid sexual norms, but they were also implicitly challenging deeply ingrained gender roles. A woman who was too independent, who formed unusually close bonds with other women, or who resisted marriage, could be seen as stepping outside her prescribed place, making her vulnerable to a broader range of accusations, including those related to witchcraft or general moral depravity, which carried their own deadly consequences. Their nonconformity was often interpreted not just as a sexual sin, but as a dangerous subversion of the social order itself. The absence of safe havens. No refuge from persecution. In a world where condemnation was so pervasive and laws so brutal, the absence of any safe haven or community where gay individuals could find acceptance, support, or even fleeting respite was a terrifying reality that profoundly shaped their ability to survive and thrive. No geopolitical sanctuary. Unlike later periods or other parts of the world, medieval Europe offered no cities, regions, or even kingdoms where same-sex relationships were openly tolerated or where one could flee for safety. The Church's doctrine and the corresponding secular laws were remarkably consistent across the Catholic West. Moving from England to France, or from Italy to the Holy Roman Empire, offered no true escape from the fundamental illegality and moral condemnation. Travel was already dangerous and expensive, and even if one managed it, they would find themselves in a new place with the same rigid laws, the same pervasive fear, and the same lack of understanding. This meant that the threat was truly inescapable within the known world. No organized community or support networks. There was no concept of an LGBTQ+ community in the medieval sense. Individuals with same-sex desires were profoundly isolated, believing themselves to be unique sinners, plagued by a monstrous vice. There were no meeting places, no secret societies beyond perhaps very small, incredibly risky personal circles, no shared language or identity beyond the pejorative sodomite. This meant that when faced with internal struggle, external suspicion, or outright accusation, individuals were utterly alone. They had no one to turn to for advice, comfort, or defense, amplifying their psychological torment and making resistance or survival incredibly difficult. The very notion of organizing or openly discussing such desires would have been an act of suicidal rebellion. Monasteries and convents. A false sense of security. While sometimes viewed as potential havens for those who didn't fit into conventional marriage, monastic life offered a false sense of security for gay individuals. Monasteries and convents were indeed single-sex environments, and some historical research suggests that same-sex affections and relationships might have occasionally developed within these walls, often coded or highly discreetly. However, these institutions were precisely where the Church's authority was most absolute, and vows of celibacy were rigorously enforced. Accusations of sodomy within a monastery or convent were devastating scandals, leading to severe ecclesiastical punishments, public degradation, and often life imprisonment or expulsion for the accused. Far from being safe havens, they were places where unnatural desires were paradoxically both more likely to occur due to the homosocial environment and more severely punished due to the higher moral expectations. The peril of shared secrets. Any intimate relationship or connection formed in this hostile environment would have been built on a foundation of extreme peril. Shared secrets meant shared vulnerability. A lover could become an informant under duress. A confidant could become an accuser out of fear or malice, or simply through an accidental slip of the tongue. This constant threat of betrayal, even from those closest to you, would make genuine trust and lasting relationships incredibly difficult, if not impossible to sustain. The psychological burden of such deeply guarded, dangerous secrets would be immense. Your modern world, though still imperfect, offers a global network of LGBTQ+ communities, legal protections in many places, and safe spaces where individuals can find support, understanding, and love. In medieval times, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no one to turn to. You were an isolated island in a sea of condemnation, making the prospect of a genuinely fulfilled life virtually non-existent and simple survival, a daily miracle of deception and fear. Imagine living in a world where there is literally no place on earth where your love is not condemned. What would be the most agonizing consequence of this absolute lack of a safe haven for a gay person in medieval times? Is it the complete isolation, the constant fear of betrayal, or the profound sense of hopelessness that no escape exists? Share your somber reflections below. The absence of hope and future, a life without fulfillment. One of the most profoundly devastating realities of existing as a gay person in medieval Europe was not merely the immediate, ever-present threat of a brutal death or crippling social isolation, but also the almost total absence of any hope for a genuinely fulfilled, happy, or authentic life. For those whose desires deviated from the rigid heterosexual norm, the entire horizon of expectation was bleak, shadowed by endless compromise, profound psychological terror, and a crushing sense of inevitability. There was simply no recognized pathway to happiness, no societal script for a life lived openly with same-sex love. The inevitable destiny, forced marriage, and deep despair. As we've thoroughly explored, marriage in medieval society was an absolute social, economic, and religious obligation, fundamentally not a matter of personal choice or romantic inclination. For men, marriage was an imperative to ensure the continuation of the family name, the inheritance of property, the securing of a lineage, and the provision of labor for the household or lord. For women, marriage was the sole path to social status, economic protection, and the fulfillment of their perceived primary role as a mother and household manager. For a gay individual, this societal imperative translated into an almost inevitable forced marriage to someone of the opposite sex, a partner for whom they felt no genuine attraction and with whom they faced the overwhelming expectation of procreation. Imagine the relentless psychological torture of sharing a bed, a life, and the most intimate moments with someone you could not truly desire, all while your only internal solace was to completely suppress, deny, and perhaps even despise your true desires. Every single day would be a performance, a lie. Every simulated gesture of affection would be a source of profound internal despair and escalating guilt. The pressure to produce legitimate heirs was immense and constant. Failure to do so, regardless of the underlying reason, which would never be understood as sexual orientation, would bring indelible shame upon your family, potentially triggering deep suspicion, accusations of barrenness, or even divine disfavor. This unchosen, inescapable life sentence would be a constant, soul-crushing weight. Exclusion from vital social and economic opportunities. Medieval gender roles and social structures were incredibly rigid, defining almost every aspect of an individual's life and opportunities. Access to property ownership, inheritance rights, positions of influence, membership in powerful guilds, or even securing a respectable trade or occupation was inextricably linked to one's marital status, familial connections, and absolute conformity to societal norms. A gay individual who by definition could not or would not conform through marriage and procreation risked being systematically excluded from these vital economic and social pathways. Without a legitimate family unit, without heirs, or without a spouse to fulfill traditional roles, an individual could be rendered an outcast, effectively denied any recognized means of support, social integration, or upward mobility. You would likely be relegated to the fringes of society, dependent on the charity of others or forced into precarious, low-status labor simply because you didn't fit the expected mold. This exclusion wasn't just about personal comfort. It was about basic survival and dignity, the impossible pursuit of authentic love and intimacy. The greatest tragedy for a gay person in medieval times was arguably the utter impossibility of openly pursuing or experiencing authentic, reciprocal love and intimacy with someone of the same sex. Every potential connection would have been fraught with extreme danger, conducted in the deepest secrecy, always under the crushing fear of discovery and brutal reprisal. There were no romantic ideals for same-sex love, no stories of gay heroes or heroines to draw inspiration from, no cultural scripts for such relationships to flourish. Any fleeting moments of connection would be overshadowed by paranoia, forcing partners to live isolated, guarded lives even when together. This constant concealment, this enforced emotional and physical repression would lead to profound loneliness and a sense of being fundamentally incomplete. The very human need for deep, loving connection would be perpetually denied or only fulfilled in terrifying, fleeting moments that carried the risk of total destruction. Imagine living a lifetime without ever truly knowing what it means to be openly loved for who you are or to love another freely and without fear. No retirement, no old age security, no legacy. In a society without welfare systems, pensions, or state-provided care, old age security was almost entirely dependent on family and children. Your children were your future caretakers, your workforce, and your legacy. For a gay individual unable to have children through a conventional marriage, or who was isolated due to their identity, old age would be a terrifying prospect of poverty, neglect, and absolute dependence on the goodwill of distant relatives or the church. There would be no one to carry on your name, no one to inherit your meager possessions, and no one to truly mourn your passing as a respected member of the community. Your potential life would be erased, your future barren, both literally and figuratively. The crushing weight of internalized hopelessness, the cumulative effect of these relentless pressures, the threat of damnation, the brutal laws, the constant surveillance, the forced marriage, the social exclusion, and the impossible dream of authentic love would undoubtedly lead to a profound and pervasive sense of internalized hopelessness. There was no "it gets better" in the medieval lexicon for gay individuals. The future offered only continued pretense, fear, and the inevitable decay into an unfulfilled old age. This existential despair, knowing that your true self was condemned and your future erased, would be a constant corrosive force, likely leading to severe depression, anxiety, and a profound weariness of spirit. Survival, in this context, meant the death of the soul long before the body gave out. Your modern world, while still having its battles, offers a burgeoning hope for LGBTQ+ individuals. The ability to marry, to form families, to openly love, to build communities, and to pursue happiness and fulfillment on their own terms. In medieval times, this hope was a luxury, a dangerous fantasy that could only be dreamed of in the deepest, most terrified corners of the mind, making every moment of existence a testament to quiet, desperate endurance rather than flourishing. Reflecting on this grim reality, what do you think would be the most soul-crushing aspect of this absolute absence of hope for a future for a gay person in medieval Europe? Is it the forced marriage, the inability to experience true love, or the terrifying prospect of a lonely and insecure old age? Share your deeply empathetic thoughts below. The Inquisition and the intertwining of sins, a system designed for eradication. As the medieval period progressed, particularly from the 13th century onwards, a new, terrifying apparatus of spiritual and legal enforcement emerged, the Papal Inquisition. While primarily established to combat heresy, its methods and its pervasive reach would prove to be yet another layer of existential threat for anyone whose desires deviated from the rigid heterosexual norm. The Inquisition represented the most systematic and zealous effort to purify Christian society, and anyone branded as unnatural was a potential target. The inquisitorial process, a legal machine against the soul. Unlike local secular courts, the Inquisition operated with a chilling dedication to discovering and eradicating perceived threats to the purity of the Catholic faith. Its procedures were specifically designed to extract confessions, rather than to establish innocence. Accusations could be made anonymously, and the accused was often not informed of the charges or their accusers. Torture, a common legal tool in secular courts, was routinely employed by the Inquisition, not necessarily as punishment, but as a means to aid the accused in confessing their sins and identifying accomplices. Imagine being subjected to the rack, the strappado, or thumb screws, with the sole purpose of forcing you to admit to acts deemed sodomy, a confession that would then seal your fate. Even if you resisted torture, your refusal to confess was often interpreted as a sign of obstinacy, further proof of your guilt, or even evidence of demonic influence making you resist the truth. The link to heresy, sodomy as spiritual rebellion. Critically, as the Church's condemnation of sodomy intensified, it became increasingly intertwined with the concept of heresy. Engaging in unnatural acts was not just a sexual sin. It was often viewed as a form of contempt for divine law, a rejection of God's created order, and therefore a form of spiritual rebellion against Christian dogma itself. This connection was devastating. While some older secular laws might have punished sodomy with hanging, the punishment for heresy was almost universally burning at the stake, a symbolic act meant to purify the soul through fire and utterly eradicate the body. If your same-sex acts or desires could be linked, even tangentially, to any form of heretical thought or practice, such as denying the sacraments, questioning church authority, or associating with known heretics, your fate was sealed and the most agonizing death awaited. This conflation of sins meant that even a minor deviation could escalate into a capital charge, leaving no room for leniency. The discovery of hidden networks. The inquisitorial process was also highly focused on uncovering and dismantling any perceived networks of deviance. If you confessed under duress, you would then be pressured to name others who engaged in similar acts or who shared your heretical views. This created a terrifying chain reaction, turning former lovers, friends, or even casual acquaintances into potential informants or victims of the same brutal process. The system was designed to expand, to ferret out every last vestige of perceived impurity, leading to widespread paranoia and utterly destroying any possibility of a nascent secret community. Trust, already fragile in medieval society, became a lethal liability in the shadow of the Inquisition. The perilous nature of confession. For many medieval individuals, the desire for salvation was paramount. The Church taught that true confession, followed by genuine repentance and penance, was the only path to absolution and eternal life. However, for a gay individual, confessing same-sex desires or acts put them in an impossible bind. A true confession might lead to horrific penances, public shaming, or even denunciation to secular authorities for capital punishment. Yet, withholding such a grave sin from confession meant living in a perpetual state of mortal sin, with the terrifying certainty of eternal damnation. This psychological trap forced individuals into an agonizing choice between temporal annihilation and eternal torment, making confession a tool not just for spiritual guidance, but for profound social control and self-incrimination. The priest, acting as both spiritual guide and arm of the Church's legal power, became a figure of both solace and profound terror. The escalation of persecution, the legal and theological machinery of the Inquisition, combined with evolving secular law, led to a demonstrable escalation in the severity and frequency of persecution. While earlier centuries might have seen fewer recorded instances, the late Middle Ages witnessed a rise in trials and executions for sodomy, particularly in areas with active inquisitorial tribunals. This wasn't necessarily because there were suddenly more gay people, but because the mechanisms for detection, accusation, and brutal punishment became more refined, more systematic, and more relentless. This period solidified the image of sodomy as an ultimate evil, making it nearly impossible for any individual perceived to be gay to live without extreme existential peril. Your modern justice systems, imperfect as they are built on principles of due process, the right to legal representation, and the protection against self-incrimination. In medieval times, particularly under the Inquisition, you would face a relentless machine designed to expose and punish perceived moral and spiritual transgressions, making a genuine defense of your identity or actions utterly futile and often leading directly to a fiery death. The material reality, poverty, vagrancy, and the dehumanization of the outcome. Beyond the religious and legal threats, the material conditions of medieval life, coupled with the societal condemnation of non-normative sexuality, created a brutal reality of poverty, vagrancy, and profound dehumanization for those who could not or would not conform. Economic vulnerability. As discussed, marriage was the primary economic unit. Without a legitimate family, without land, which was tied to inheritance and lineage, and without a recognized trade, often tied to guilds that required stable household structures, an individual branded as a sodomite or simply living outside the accepted sexual norms would face immense economic vulnerability. They would be shut out of most respectable professions, relegated to marginal labor, or forced into begging. This meant a constant struggle for basic sustenance, food, shelter, and clothing, in an era where poverty often meant starvation or death from exposure and disease. Vagrancy and its dangers. Being an outcast often meant becoming a vagrant, constantly moving from place to avoid detection or find temporary work. Vagrancy itself was viewed with deep suspicion in medieval society, often associated with criminality, moral depravity, and dangerous outsiders. You would constantly be at risk of arrest, harassment by local authorities, or exploitation by others. The open road, far from being a path to freedom, was fraught with dangers, bandits, disease, hunger, and the constant threat of being recognized or denounced in a new village. Lack of property and rights. An individual without a recognized social place or family unit had virtually no property rights, no legal standing, and no voice. If your few possessions were stolen, if you were cheated, or if you were physically assaulted, you would have almost no recourse. The law, far from protecting you, was actively seeking your condemnation. This constant vulnerability to exploitation and harm would make daily existence a terrifying struggle for survival, eroding any sense of safety or dignity. Social dehumanization. The relentless condemnation from the church, the law, and society would lead to profound dehumanization. An individual branded as a sodomite was seen not as a fellow human being with inherent dignity, but as a monstrous sinner, an agent of the devil, a defiler of the natural order. This dehumanization made it easier for people to condone and participate in brutal punishments, seeing you as less than human, deserving of your agonizing fate. The psychological impact of being seen as a monster, an abomination, would be incredibly corrosive, further isolating you and destroying any sense of self-worth. The shadow of the gallows or the pyre. Even if you managed to evade formal detection for years, the constant lurking threat of denunciation and public execution would dictate every aspect of your life. Every new acquaintance, every moment of intimacy, every rumor in the wind would remind you that your precarious existence could end at any moment in agony and public shame. This omnipresent specter of death, not just as an end to life but as a final act of public degradation and theological damnation, would be a constant, suffocating weight, preventing any true peace or security. Your modern world, while still struggling with inequality, offers a social safety net, human rights protections, and at least the theoretical right to live free from arbitrary violence and destitution based on your identity. In medieval times, being outside the rigid social and sexual norms meant a life of relentless insecurity, profound poverty, constant danger, and an overwhelming sense of being dehumanized, utterly alone, and always just one accusation away from a horrific public death. Considering these layers of systemic dehumanization and material precarity, what do you think would be the most difficult aspect of simply surviving day to day for a gay person in medieval Europe, beyond the immediate threat of execution? Is it the constant hunger and lack of security, the pervasive fear of being noticed, or the agonizing experience of being seen as less than human? Share your unsettling insights below. The eradication of identity, a death sentence to selfhood and history. Beyond the physical threats and the psychological torment, medieval society sought to impose a far more insidious death sentence on those with same-sex desires, the complete eradication of their identity, their history, and their very selfhood. This wasn't just about killing the body, it was about extinguishing the very concept that such individuals could exist. The power of linguistic erasure, no words for being. In medieval Europe, the very language available to describe same-sex attraction was profoundly limited and overwhelmingly negative. There were no neutral terms like gay, lesbian, homosexual, or bisexual. The primary term sodomite was a legal and theological condemnation, not an identity. It referred to an act and a sin, not an inherent orientation. This linguistic void meant that individuals experiencing same-sex desires had no words to articulate their feelings, no shared vocabulary to connect with others, and no framework to understand themselves as anything other than a sinner or a monster. This erasure from language contributed immensely to the isolation and self-loathing, making it almost impossible to conceive of a positive self-identity, let alone a collective one. Your very being was literally unnameable, unheard of, and therefore, in the eyes of society, non-existent except as an abomination. The absence of a collective memory. Because same-sex relationships were so vehemently condemned and often brutally punished, medieval society deliberately sought to erase any public record or cultural memory of their existence. Unlike heterosexual love, which was celebrated in countless songs, poems, and stories, same-sex affection was hidden, destroyed, or deliberately distorted when it surfaced. This means that individuals had no historical precedents, no figures from the past to look to for inspiration, no shared heritage of struggle or survival. They were cut off from any sense of continuity, trapped in a timeless, singular struggle against overwhelming odds. This historical erasure was a death sentence to any potential future recognition or understanding, condemning countless lives to anonymity and oblivion. Forced conformity as a form of death. For those who survived, by meticulously hiding their true selves, by entering into heterosexual marriages, or by joining celibate religious orders, their survival came at an immense cost. It was a form of living death, a constant performance of a false identity. Every day was a lie, every intimate moment a deception. This forced conformity suffocated authenticity, demanding the suppression of genuine emotion, desire, and connection. While the body might live, the true self, the individual's core identity, was denied expression, relegated to the darkest corners of the mind, a ghost haunting a life not truly their own. This was a slow, agonizing death of the spirit, a surrender to the societal expectation that certain desires must simply cease to exist. The inevitable end, discovery or despair. For many, the constant pressure of living a hidden life, coupled with the ever-present threat of exposure, would lead to an inevitable breaking point. Some might be discovered, leading to the brutal legal consequences we've discussed. Others, unable to bear the psychological burden, might succumb to despair, mental breakdown, or even take their own lives. The long-term prognosis for someone living authentically, or even quietly, with same-sex desires in medieval times, was overwhelmingly grim, often culminating in either a violent state-sanctioned death or a profound personal tragedy born of relentless societal pressure and internal conflict. There was no happily ever after for those who loved differently. The legacy of fear and secrecy. The medieval period's brutal condemnation of same-sex relations cast a long, chilling shadow over subsequent centuries, influencing legal systems, religious doctrines, and social attitudes well into the modern era. The fear, the secrecy, the internalized guilt, and the pervasive silence surrounding LGBTQ+ identities are direct descendants of this medieval legacy. Even in places and times where direct execution might have ceased, the psychological and social death sentence, the mandate to be invisible, ashamed, and non-existent, persisted for centuries, demonstrating the profound and lasting impact of this dark chapter in history. The medieval period didn't just kill people, it built a framework of fear designed to kill identity itself. The story of being gay in medieval times is, in its most profound sense, a story of a death sentence. Not only a literal death at the stake or gallows, but a death of self, a death of hope, and a deliberate violent erasure from history. It is a testament to the power of a society, unified by fear and rigid doctrine, to attempt to annihilate a fundamental aspect of human diversity. But even in the deepest, darkest corners of these forgotten times, the human spirit yearned for connection, in whispered secrets, in stolen glances, in coded poems, and in the sheer unimaginable courage of simply enduring. Individuals found ways to exist. Their lives, though often tragically cut short or lived in agonizing silence, were not entirely in vain. Their very existence, their refusal to completely disappear, stands as a testament to the enduring power of human love and identity, even when facing a world determined to extinguish it entirely. The rope may have silenced their voices, the fire may have consumed their bodies, but their truth, their humanity, and their unwavering, dangerous capacity for love still echo through the vast corridors of history. It serves as a stark, chilling reminder of how far we have come and how vigilantly we must protect the freedoms and acceptance that so many before us were brutally denied. Their stories, finally unearthed from centuries of suppression, are not just tales of despair, but powerful, enduring declarations of life, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of those who dared to love in a world that demanded they cease to exist. This is what it was really like to be gay in medieval Europe, a profound, inescapable death sentence, yet a testament to humanity's enduring, luminous spirit. Before you go, take a moment to reflect on the immense journey we've taken through this challenging history. What is the single most powerful lesson you take away from understanding why being gay in medieval times was a death sentence? What does it teach us about society, humanity, or the importance of acceptance today? Drop a final comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you found this exploration impactful. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these vital, often difficult, historical truths to light.